Greetings and welcome back to PBH 275, Injury Prevention and Control. This week's module is the last module of new materials before the end of the semester. This week's topic, the role of emergency planning and preparedness in injury prevention. Emergencies and disasters are events that can lead to serious injuries and deaths in large swaths of a community. And they can be unpredictable and sometimes even unknowable until they happen. We don't always know when an earthquake's going to happen, or a massive wildfire is going to erupt, or when a civil disturbance or a bioterrorism event or a mass casualty event will occur. Some emergencies and disasters, however, are predictable, or if not predictable, they're at least knowable. It's anticipated that they could happen. Therefore, we can expect that they might happen. And then some disasters and emergencies can actually be prevented through adequate planning and preparation. So the key question for this module is, how do governments and individuals plan and prepare for these events in order to minimize injuries and loss of life and increase resilience? Let's start by defining emergency and disaster planning. This type of planning are the steps taken by governments, businesses, organizations, or other entities for the coordination and management of resources and responsibilities which pertain to the prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery from an emergency. As far as those separate terms, prevention are the actions that you take to decrease the likelihood that the emergency will occur in the first place. Mitigation comes into play when you have the actions you take to eliminate or reduce the loss of life and property related to an act that cannot be prevented. An example of that would be earthquakes. We can't stop earthquakes from happening. We would have to do mitigation at that point. Preparedness, we will define preparedness on its own in the next slide, but preparedness is also an important part of planning. That's where you develop policies and protocols, incident command systems, training, planning, coordination, and exercises so that you're prepared for a potential crisis. The responses are the actions you take to effectively contain or resolve the crisis or emergency. And then recovery, that's after the disaster or emergency has passed. That's the process of assisting people in the healing and restoring processes and trying to get the community continuity back. Now, as I just hinted at a second ago, some disasters can be prevented through emergency planning. Things such as unintentional chemical releases, for example. Those can be prevented through emergency planning. But of course, not all disasters can be prevented through emergency planning. Most natural disasters fall into that category. So while I just gave you a definition of preparedness in the context of emergency and disaster planning, preparedness has its own commonly used definition outside of the realm of planning as well. And that's the steps taken by individuals or community members to make sure they are safe before, during, and after an emergency or natural disaster. And local, state, and federal governments are involved in preparedness as well. That earlier definition of emergency planning included preparedness, as we talked about just a second ago. The thing about preparedness is that it alone does not generally prevent disasters. Again, to the degree that disasters can be prevented. It mitigates the damage that can be done to individuals and communities during a disaster, and helps with resilience and recovery after a disaster. That's essentially what preparedness does. When you have a major emergency or disaster, it also often creates at the same time, or maybe shortly lagging afterward, a public health emergency. This is an event that overwhelms the routine health capabilities or capacities of the healthcare and public health systems. When medical systems become overwhelmed after an emergency or disaster, that sometimes leads to triage, where only the people who need the care the worst, who are in the most acute crisis, will get the care, and other people will have to wait. When public health systems get overwhelmed, this sometimes happens during earthquakes and fires and other events where the water treatment systems will fail, or they will be deluged and overrun, especially if you have a combined sewer system that where both the sanitary sewer and storm sewer water go to the same place, the public health systems get overwhelmed, and that's often why it's not safe to drink the water from the taps for several hours to days after a major natural disaster event, because the public health systems got overwhelmed. Public health emergencies can occur with natural disasters, they can occur with pandemics, as we've seen during COVID-19. Man-made events can also create a public health emergency, and the sad and tragic example that we're all familiar with here in the Vegas Valley is the 1 October shooting. There are a lot of different conditions that can create disasters or emergencies for which we need to have planning and preparedness in place to reduce injuries. Some of them are very quick happening, some of them are slow moving. Examples of these types of causes of these disasters could be winter storms, tsunamis, an outbreak of an infectious disease, chemical releases or spills, bioterrorism events, terrorist attacks, war and conflict and civil disturbances. Drought is another example. If our drought conditions keep worsening here in the southwestern United States, we will reach a critical point where it could become an emergency for medical and public health reasons and possibly civil disturbance, and we need to be prepared for the types of negative outcomes that could occur as a result of prolonged drought. If we want to simplify emergency management, we should start by saying that, for the most part, all emergencies are local. Now, sometimes when you might have an emergency that's affecting a lot of localities at once, such as a hurricane bearing down on the Gulf Coast, where you have multiple communities and states that are all sort of feeling the same brunt of something at the same time. But for the most part, all emergencies start out as local events. As the scale and complexity of the emergency increases, for things such as hurricanes, the local governments will request support from the state. When the situation of the emergency is also beyond the capability of the state to handle, the governor of the affected state can request help from the president. And the response to such catastrophic events will trigger resources from multiple jurisdictions and agencies and multiple levels of government. It surprises a lot of people to know that the U.S. government has not really had a uniform federal level emergency management protocols in place for very long, really not since about 1979. That's when emergency management was institutionalized by the creation of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Before FEMA came into existence, local and state governments would request help from the federal government when big disasters occurred. Those disasters mostly led only to piecemeal or ad hoc legislation and local action. In other words, if one particular state who had a fairly influential senator was able to get a bill passed through both houses of Congress to allocate some money for recovery of this particular state from this particular disaster, then that could happen. But there was no federal agency that had its own budget that was that had as their charter duty to respond to these sort of things. So as you can imagine, with no uniform federal response prior to the era of FEMA, there was a lot of local inequities. A lot of local and state areas whose maybe politicians were not particularly well liked or didn't have a lot of power. Oftentimes their constituents suffered as a result. So there were serious inequities and social and environmental injustices that resulted before we had FEMA. There is one federal power that's existed since 1944, and that's the ability to declare a public health emergency, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services can do this. And again, go back to a few slides back, I defined what a public health emergency is. A lot of different emergencies and disasters will often trigger a public health emergency as well. So while FEMA has only existed since 1979, before that, since 1944, any types of disaster that also constituted a public health emergency, there could be a federal emergency declaration. made by the HHS Secretary. And what these declarations do is they permit the spending of additional federal funds on the public health emergency conditions to mitigate them. The Secretary of HHS may take such actions as may be appropriate to respond to the public health emergency. That's given as a power under this Public Health Services Act of 1944. The HHS Secretary also can authorize the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to impose federal quarantine for specific diseases. So this power has existed since 1944, but it's not for response to all emergencies, just public health emergencies. In addition to the establishment of FEMA in 1979, another very important piece of legislation for responding to disasters and emergencies occurred in 1988, and that was the Stafford Act. The Stafford Act is what gave us what we all are now familiar with as the presidential disaster declaration power, where the president can declare something a major disaster or emergency, and when the president does that, and it can be a federal event, it can be a state level event, a local level event, but just has to be declared a major disaster or emergency. And when the president declares that, it provides both authorities and funds for federal response and assistance to states and localities that are being affected by the disaster. Now, a presidential disaster declaration doesn't just happen automatically. It has to be spurred by a request from lower level governments. A governor or a tribal leader has to request a presidential disaster declaration, and it can only be done after the state has responded and it's been determined that state level resources are not enough to deal with and mitigate this disaster or emergency. So it's not an unlimited power, but it is a very important power that's brought a lot of order and a lot of resources to disaster response here in the United States. In addition to the federal government being able to step in and provide direction and planning and resources whenever a major disaster or emergency occurs, before disasters and emergencies occur, the federal government can use funding as a tool to sort of encourage states and local governments in their preparedness planning. And a great example of this would be one of the provisions of the Older Americans Act is that state and local aging agencies have to engage in preparedness planning. They have to create plans that contain information about how they coordinate activities with other government and nonprofit agencies. Particularly, this really becomes an issue whenever you have an evacuation event that needs to occur and you've got an older population that's maybe non-ambulatory or that has a lot of special medical needs. This is something that the lack of adequate aging agency preparedness planning caused a lot of the deaths that occurred in the Gulf Coast area following Hurricane Katrina. So now if states want to receive federal funding, the Older Americans Act stipulates that they have to have this level of preparedness planning. They have to create these local plans that say specifically what they're going to do in the event of a shelter-in-place emergency or an evacuation emergency or any other type of foreseeable emergency event. How are they going to make sure that older Americans in their jurisdiction are not disproportionately impacted or left behind? These local plans, again, they're very local, they're very specific. They must be approved by states. The state government has to look over them and approve them. They usually have an emergency management coordinator that does that. And then these approved state plans are tied to federal funding. You're not going to get the federal funding if you don't have state plans for all of the affected jurisdictions that you have. For the next several minutes, we're going to talk about one of my favorite pieces of legislation in terms of injury prevention and emergency planning and preparedness. We're going to talk about the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. The reason why I want to talk about it, well, the name kind of says it all. What this act covers is any kind of areas that are near chemical facilities, any facilities where hazardous chemicals are present. So pretty much any place where anything is manufactured, where water treatment goes on, where certain retail operations. Basically, almost everybody in the U.S. could potentially be affected if there was a chemical spill or reaction or something that occurred in one of these facilities, and almost everybody in the United States lives fairly close to one of these facilities. And this act requires emergency planning at the state and local level. It was really a landmark law which tied together facilities with hazardous chemicals to the community around them, including the public health infrastructure at the state and local level. I wanted to talk about this law in more detail rather than lumping it in with the other injury prevention laws in the Week 11 lecture, because the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act is so important. It's the most vivid example we have of how emergency planning can prevent or mitigate foreseeable disasters that could cause devastating numbers of injuries and deaths if we didn't have the planning. The first thing I'll say about the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act is that it's an act created by congressional legislation rather than a regulation. And again, both acts and regulations are law. The acts and statutes are directly from the elected legislature, whereas regulations are promulgated by executive branch administrative agencies through powers granted by legislators, though they should carry the same legal weight. And we talked about this earlier. Acts and statutes do not face the same questions of legislative intent that administrative regulations do. If an act is passed by both houses of Congress and then signed by the president, there is little to no doubt about what the intent was of the legislation. The other common name that you will sometimes see for the EPCRA is SARA Title III, where SARA is the Superfunds Amendment and Reauthorization Act of 1986. If you ever see somebody talking about SARA Title III compliance, they're talking about compliance with the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. They're the same thing. The unfortunate truth, and we see this all the time with public health laws, is that laws or actions to benefit the public health often do not occur until after a tragedy occurs, which brings home the reason why the action is necessary. And that was the case with the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. The tragedy happened half a world away, but it set the wheels in motion that led to the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. In the overnight hours of December 3rd, 1984, in the city of Bhopal, in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh, there was an unintentional release of methyl isocyanate gas from a Union Carbide plant. Again, it happened in the middle of the night. Methyl isocyanate is a crucial intermediate for manufacturing carbamate pesticides such as carbaryl, better known as 7, and aldicarb. There was a huge loss of life from this overnight release of methyl isocyanate. The estimates are that there were at least 8,000 deaths within 3 days after the chemical release, and after 20,000 total deaths, which have been attributed to the methyl isocyanate leak and the aftermath. So what happened in the middle of the night was this vessel that contained methyl isocyanate failed. A huge cloud of this MIC gas went into the town of Bhopal. Thousands of people were overcome as they slept, and many of them died from acute poisoning. Now, there was no alert put out into the community during the release event or immediately afterward. The Union Carbide plant did not have any special sirens in the community that went off to let people know that a spill had occurred. None of that happened, so people were just overcome and died in their sleep, many of them. What compounded the tragedy was the fact that there were many firefighters and other first responders that when they got alerted that something was going on at the Union Carbide plant, they didn't know the nature of the hazards they faced at the site, and so they went to the site. They were overcome by methyl isocyanate gases, and many of the firefighters and first responders also died. So I hope you see why this was, obviously it was a devastating human tragedy, but it was also incredibly preventable. How if the community would have been notified somehow, they could have evacuated and maybe fewer people would have died. If the firefighters and other first responders knew the natures of the hazards they were facing, they would have had possibly adequate personal protective equipment, and they wouldn't have died. So you can see why complete lack of emergency planning and preparation for what should have been a foreseeable event resulted in thousands of deaths and many more thousands of injuries, and just a huge devastation for this whole community. What's important to note here also is that Union Carbide was a U.S. company. They had similar manufacturing plants to the one in Bhopal in many other parts of the world, including in the United States. This was not a case where this plant was built with lax safety standards because it was located in a country that maybe didn't have as strict of regulations. That actually was not the case. Union Carbide had built all of their plants to the same specifications all across the world. What was quickly noted by the media here in the United States in the aftermath of the Bhopal disaster and tragedy was that there were two Union Carbide plants here in the United States, one in Institute, West Virginia, one in Woodbine, Georgia, that were the exact same design and layout as the one in Bhopal and had the same chemical hazards. So of course, that got a lot of people asking the question, could this kind of tragedy happen here in the United States? The question of whether such a mass casualty disaster event could happen in the United States, the answer to that was obvious to anybody who cared about public health at the time or had done a little bit of investigation into the sort of conditions that existed around some of these chemical plants in the U.S. But the Deputy EPA Administrator, Jack McGraw, was actually directly quoted in early 1985 in response to that question, saying, yes, it could happen here. And in a way of sort of revealing our vulnerability to this happening, one of those two Union Carbide plants that were in the U.S., the one at Institute, West Virginia, actually had a chemical release that affected the neighboring community. Now, it was not methyl isocyanate. It was another chemical called aldecarb oxime, and which is not quite as dangerous as methyl isocyanate, and there was a smaller amount. More than 100 people in the area of Institute, West Virginia, had to be hospitalized, though, as a result of this leak from a Union Carbide plant. And of course, the fact that it was a Union Carbide plant and a chemical leak, and that the Bhopal tragedy was still fresh on so many people's minds, this was a vivid demonstration of the horrors that could occur from a massive chemical release, and what can happen when a community did not know how to respond. So, media coverage of the Bhopal disaster, and then the media noting the similarities between the Bhopal plant and the plants in Institute, West Virginia, and Woodbine, Georgia, and then the media coverage of the aldecarb oxime spill that hospitalized over 100 people in Institute, West Virginia. You add all those up together, it created a public desire for protection and also a right to know what's going on behind the walls of that plant, that chemical plant, that facility that's in their community. What also created an appetite for regulation was the fact that earlier in 1985, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration had promulgated a new law called the Workplace Hazard Communication and Right to Know Law, and it covered employees. So a lot of people in their workplaces were suddenly being told the chemicals that they were working with. They were being handed what were then known as material safety data sheets for the first time and given training, and were being told over and over again that you have a right to know these chemicals that you work with, because that was a brand new OSHA regulation at the time. Well, now the community outside the workplace was demanding a similar right, a right to know what was going on behind the walls of that facility or that plant. So the sum result of all of that political pressure created by this was that there was strong bipartisan support for what we now know as the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. It came into being relatively quickly as a result of direct action and pressure. It was signed into law on October 17, 1986 by President Ronald Reagan. Now, President Reagan was not exactly known to be a big fan of governmental regulation, but there was so much support for this and such a demonstrated need for this that it passed both houses and the president without really almost no opposition whatsoever. So, what does the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act do? The most important thing that it does is that it requires covered facilities, and I will define covered facilities in the next slide, but they are required to identify, inventory, and report their quantities of hazardous chemicals to state and local government entities. Specifically, covered facilities have to submit what's called Tier 2 reports. These are the reports that list the quantities of hazardous chemicals within the facility. These have to be sent to the State Emergency Response Commission, which I'll talk about shortly, and the local Emergency Planning Committee, which I'll also talk about shortly, and local fire departments. The Act also establishes a mechanism for state and local level emergency planning for catastrophic releases from these facilities. It also created the Toxics Release Inventory, or TRI. What the TRI does is that you can use the TRI to notify the community and the general public about chemical releases, even those which do not rise to the level of public health emergency. You can actually look up TRI data for any company that's covered under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. You can know how many pounds or kilograms of certain chemicals they released into the environment in the past year, or how many spill events they had, even if it wasn't a spill that was going to cause a major emergency outside the walls of the facility. The TRI also describes waste management activities at the covered facilities. What are these covered facilities under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act? These are private or public facilities that have one or more of the extremely hazardous substances at levels above a threshold planning quantity. And both the extremely hazardous substances and the threshold planning quantities for those substances are spelled out in the Act. At the current moment, there are almost 500 substances that are on the extremely hazardous substances list and therefore regulated by the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. The threshold planning quantities that make you a covered facility differ greatly, as you can see from this example. Nitric acid. You have to have 1,000 pounds of nitric acid before you're covered under this act. For anhydrous ammonia, the threshold planning quantity is only 500 pounds. For chlorine, the threshold planning quantity is 100 pounds. What this means is that almost any municipal water treatment plant is going to be a covered facility under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, because almost all of them will have more than 100 pounds of chlorine. Local pools and aquatic centers will often have more than 100 pounds of chlorine on site, so this is not just a law for chemical facilities. Yeah, it seems the law was designed with those facilities in mind, places like Union Carbide or gigantic petrochemical plants where if something goes wrong, hundreds or thousands of people in the surrounding community could be affected. But it's not just for chemical facilities. It's any facility that possesses an extremely hazardous substance above the threshold planning quantity. And as you can see, some of these threshold planning quantities are very low. Phosgene is an important precursor in polyurethane manufacturing, but it's also a very powerful respiratory toxin. If you have 10 pounds of phosgene on site, you're a covered facility. Nickel carbonyl is used for nickel coating other metals. It's a very reactive compound and it's acutely toxic. You're covered under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act if you only have 1 pound of nickel carbonyl at your facility. So again, it's not just chemical factories or manufacturing facilities that are covered under this act. It could be water treatment plants, pools, your local farm supply store like CAL Ranch or Tractor Supply Company. there's a good chance that on any given day they will have 500 pounds or more of anhydrous and ammonia on site. In which case, yeah, they're covered under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. For facilities that have not previously been covered by the Act, but they receive a shipment that pushes them over the environmental hazardous substances threshold planning quantity for one or more substances, they have to submit a report to their local emergency planning committee within 60 days. Now, the responsibilities of state and local authorities under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act will be discussed next. Covered facilities have specific responsibilities under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, which include the following. These covered facilities must have an emergency response plan, which is kept and reviewed by local and state officials. We'll talk about these local and state officials in just a second. These emergency response plans, at least as the Act was originally drawn, were supposed to be made available to the public as well. This way the public would not be surprised about what kinds of possible chemical hazards are lurking in their neighborhoods. Now, that being said, again, the Act came out in 1986. In 2001, a lot of things changed after 9/11, and then with the Patriot Act and subsequent amendments. Some of this information has been curtailed a little bit. We don't have the right as the public to know every single consequence analysis and disaster thing that could go on inside a plant, because that's information that could be useful for terrorists. So the public availability is still there, but it's a little bit limited now. If you want to review an emergency response plan, you might have to go to a special reading room to do it. You probably won't be allowed to copy it. So yeah, it's still an element, but it's been curtailed somewhat in the post 9/11 realities. Covered facilities must do mitigation drills. This means that they actually have to do real practices where they simulate different responses to different disasters, such as, just imagine whatever kind of disaster can occur inside these facilities. They have to do mitigation drills to make sure that they can do things to mitigate or prevent public release of hazardous chemicals. What's really important, and another important responsibility, is that these covered facilities must give their local emergency responders updated chemical inventories and consequence analysis information. The reason why this is critical, we talked about it when I was talking about the Bhopal disaster. If emergency responders don't know the nature of the hazards they're facing when they respond to an alarm or a situation at a facility, that can compound the disaster and compound the tragedy. And this helps ensure that emergency responders have the proper equipment with them, not just to protect themselves, but also sometimes the emergency responders are the ones that shut off the valve or stop the chemical reaction or do the thing that actually prevents the greater community from being affected. So this is a responsibility of covered facilities. They have to make sure their local emergency responders have this information and that it's up to date. Where necessary and appropriate, it's also the responsibility of covered facilities to provide potentially affected neighbors, those people who live near the facility and who could be affected by a disastrous release, to actually provide these neighbors with information and in some cases supplies in order to protect themselves in the event of a spill or release. So certainly providing information about what goes on at the facility. Again, they don't have to provide the full emergency response plan, or there's limitations to that, but they do have to provide some general information and instructions about what to expect if the plant siren starts to go off, for example. In some cases, these covered facilities have been obligated by local and state governments to provide their neighbors with emergency radios that will put out a broadcast in the event that something goes wrong and the neighbors need to know. For some disasters, for some types of spills, for example, sheltering in place is what you need to do rather than evacuating. In that case, these covered facilities are responsible for providing their neighbors with shelter-in-place instructions and in some cases equipment. This would be things like 6 mil plastic sheeting and tape to ensure that people can sort of prevent a lot of infiltration of toxic gases and vapors getting into their house while a situation is unfolding. And in some cases, antidotes are provided by the covered facility. This happens a lot of times around nuclear power plants, where if you are a neighbor of a nuclear power plant, the nuclear power plant might provide you with some potassium iodide tablets to take, so that if there's ever an emergency, you can take a spill or a release of radioactive material. You can take the potassium iodide tablets, which will saturate your thyroid and prevent radioactive iodine from binding to your thyroid. Again, there's not always a requirement for this, but sometimes local conditions and local and state governments will mandate that covered facilities have to provide these things. The Act also spelled out some responsibilities that fall at the state level. Every state must designate a state emergency response commission. Now, these state emergency response commissions will direct and coordinate the actions of the local emergency planning committees, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The state emergency response commissions will also collect and review those EPA Tier 2 and toxic release inventory reports from covered facilities. We talked about those reports before. The CERC are the ones that actually collect and review them to make sure that everything looks good in the way it's supposed to look. Here in Nevada, the State Emergency Response Commission has up to 25 members. It's not fully staffed at the moment, but it can have up to 25 members, all of whom are appointed by the governor. Now, the CERC membership is a mixture of emergency management, fire, law enforcement, military, public health, industry personnel, including personnel from some of the covered facilities, and concerned community members. The current co-chairs of the CERC in Nevada are Dennis Nolan, who's the EMS Division Chief for the Reno Fire Department, and Richard Brenner, who's the Hazardous Materials Coordinator for the Clark County Fire Department. At the local level, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act states that there must be local emergency planning committees established, or LEPCs. The LEPCs are designated and supervised by the CERC, the State Emergency Response Commission that we talked about in the previous slide. And the Act specifically states that all of these interests must be represented in the local emergency planning committee. They must include elected state and local officials, representatives from law enforcement, fire, civil defense, first aid, public health, local environmental, hospital, and transportation personnel, members of the broadcast or print media, community groups, and owners or representatives of covered facilities. So as you can see, a local emergency planning committee, when it's fully staffed, can have quite a few members. It also could be a great opportunity for public health graduates to serve their community. Again, they're not directly appointed by the governor. For the most part, you can just reach out to your LEPC, and if they have an opening or need somebody to serve on one, and you're a public health or public health-minded person, there's a decent chance you might get a chance to serve on your local emergency planning committee. Here in Nevada, every single county, plus Carson City, which is sort of a merged city-county government equivalent, each of them represents a local emergency planning district with a corresponding LEPC. So that means that Clark County has its own LEPC. Because, as we said earlier, most disasters are local, therefore, the local emergency planning committees have a great deal of responsibilities for emergency management and under the EPCRA. The first responsibility of every LEPC is that they must complete an emergency plan, which encompasses the varieties of hazards posed by the covered facilities within that planning district. There are numerous templates available for how to create an emergency plan. However, the emergency plan cannot be a canned plan. It must deal with specific problems that could occur due to the particular facilities located in the planning district. Again, it can't be boilerplate. It needs to be specific and updated. It has to be updated at least annually. The emergency plan has to be made available to the public. It can be updated even more than annually if new information requires it. For example, let's say a new facility opens within your planning district, which is going to create a new community hazard. Then that emergency plan could be updated more than annually. And as I said before, it's sort of like with plant-specific emergency response plans. The LEPC's emergency plan is generally made available to the public. There can be limitations if there's parts of it that are considered to be sensitive and could be information you don't want to get in the wrong hands. And in that case, they usually make provisions so that you can, if you're a member of the public and want to review the emergency plan for your local planning district, you can, but with some limitations. LEPCs also are responsible for acquiring and utilizing resources to develop, implement, and exercise their emergency plan and to provide public safeguards. A lot of times your LEPC will pursue federal and state grants so that they can provide everybody in their district with an emergency radio or with plastic sheeting or whatever it is that might sort of help safeguard the public in the event that some bad thing happens involving one of these covered facilities. I've talked a lot about the emergency planning elements of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, but as the name implies, there's also a significant community right to know element of the Act. So let's address some community right to know issues here. As I said before, emergency response plans for plants and also the emergency plans from the LEPC must be made available to the public, though subsequent legislation, mostly the Patriot Act and subsequent amendments, have reduced the availability of sections that discuss, for example, the likely consequences of an incident or release. Because these consequence analyses can be very detailed. They can talk about how if a particular chemical vessel ruptures under certain weather conditions, how depending on the way the wind's blowing, that up to, say, 4,000 people could die within 20 minutes. That's the kind of information that if it gets out there into the wrong hands, could be used for very bad purposes. And that's the community right to know has been curtailed a little bit in post 9/11. But you can still learn that. It's just a little more curtailed now. Those toxics release inventory data must be made available to the public. The Tier 2 reports, which include chemical names, quantities, manner of storage, and the location of chemicals within a facility, those must also be made available to the public. Now, even before 9/11, facilities had the ability to withhold certain information in Tier 2 reports from being released to the public. This would be the information that can be considered trade secret information. Like they don't want a competitor to see what kinds of chemicals and processes they're running because that's protected information. And, of course, facilities can opt to withhold information on locations of particular chemicals if those chemicals could be used not just for terrorism purposes, but during some of the methamphetamine epidemic has kind of gone up and down at various times in the United States, and there have been times when people who manufacture methamphetamine have used community right to know to figure out which local plants and facilities might have some of the precursor chemicals that they need for manufacturing meth. Facilities have subsequently been able to withhold information on the locations of particular chemicals in order to not make it so easy for thieves to find them. And the local emergency planning committees must provide public notice of their activities, and they have to receive and respond to public comments. Most LEPCs will also have their meetings public, even though that's not specifically required, but at the very least they have to let the public know when they're planning on meeting, and they have to receive and respond to all comments from the public. So now I hope you understand why I wanted to talk so much about the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. It's an act that really provides us with disaster mitigation and injury prevention through information. Now, every U.S. facility that can pose a threat to public health due to unintentional or intentional releases are covered by an emergency response plan. Public health personnel have a voice in emergency planning, especially at the local level, through service on an LAPC. Potentially affected citizens are knowledgeable and in some cases even drilled on how to respond in the immediate aftermath of an incident. Just knowing what's in the neighborhood can make such a difference. Because of this act and the way it's been carried out here in the United States over the last 35 years, now it's a lot less likely that a major tragic event like the Bhopal disaster can happen here. As we get near the end now, I want to briefly talk about preparedness at the individual or household level. And I first want to acknowledge that preparedness can require intense efforts on the part of individuals or households to think about what are some of the foreseeable emergencies that can impact you or your household, and then make sure that you're, in as much as you can be, are ready for them. It doesn't just require intense effort. In some cases, it requires a lot of resources, which, depending on your socioeconomic conditions, you might not have a lot of resources available to you. And so we just need to acknowledge that that's a barrier to adequate preparedness here in the United States. Back in 2012, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did a survey study in 14 different states. What they found was that just a little over half of all households in these 14 states had a 3-day supply of water in the event that, water supplies got cut off because of a public health disaster, infrastructural damage, something like that, civil unrest. Just a little over 20% of all households had any kind of even fundamental written evacuation plan, which that number seems high, but then you consider that a written evacuation plan can be as simple as, writing down who you're going to call, who's going to keep your pets if you have to evacuate, just little simple things like that, that almost 80% of households didn't even have that. The groups least likely to be fully prepared for disaster were people of color, specifically Hispanics. Of those 14 states evaluated in this 2012 CDC study, Nevada respondents were the least likely to have a 3-day supply of food. Only 78.5% of all Nevadans surveyed for this study had a 3-day supply of food. That was lowest among the 14 states. A 3-day supply of medication, same thing, 80.7%, lowest among the 14 states. Having a working battery-powered radio, because sometimes the electrical grid will fail during disasters, and so having a battery-powered radio is very important to receive information. Just a little over 72% of Nevada respondents had a battery-powered radio that worked. That was, again, the lowest among the 14 surveyed states. So I want you all to be prepared for the types of foreseeable emergency or disasters that could occur. And just think about, what are the ones that are most common in your area? Here in southern Nevada, the most likely types of disasters and emergencies would be wildfires, particularly if you live in the urban woods interface on the far west or far east ends of the valley. Wildfires, earthquakes. Nevada's a fairly active seismic zone. Floods, even though we don't get a lot of rain here, when it does happen, it can be very intense, and though we have detention basins and other structures built, they can still be overwhelmed by heavy rains. Extreme weather events, including drought, which is more of a long-term, slow-moving disaster, but still something we need to plan for. And civil disturbances. The unfortunate truth is that Las Vegas in particular, because of what it represents, could be a target for civil disturbances or possible terrorism activities. You should try to make sure you have enough supplies for 72 hours. This means building a preparedness kit. There are lots of instructions online for how to build a preparedness kit. The important thing to remember, though, is that once you build it, it's not done forever. Preparedness kits require maintenance. Foods expire, medicines expire. Sometimes the plastic containers that water is kept in will fail, and the water will leak out. So Preparedness kits do require maintenance, and that does sometimes require resource expenditures. It's very important to actually create a plan, and it's important to write it down so that when bad things happen, you can refer back to it and you kind of, because we're not always the most clear-headed whenever a disaster is unfolding around us. So that plan should have several things written in it, like who are you going to touch base with when the disaster starts? What types of foreseeable emergencies do you anticipate? Because some of them will require sheltering in place, and that's a totally different scenario than if you have to evacuate. So you need to think about both the foreseeable emergencies that require sheltering in place and how you're going to do that, have it written down, and what types require evacuation and how you're going to do that, and how you're going to provide for things such as if you have to go to an evacuation shelter that maybe doesn't accept pets and you have a pet, what are you going to do about that? If you or someone in your household has ambulatory issues where you can't easily move around, how are you going to accommodate that? This all needs to be part of your plan and written down. Where will be your meeting point if you all have to do a quick evacuation without necessarily having a chance to communicate first? And making sure that you have up-to-date, out-of-state contact information so that people who are in areas maybe not affected by the disaster, people that you can reach to check in and let them know that you're okay. So if you can do something like that, again, we can't prevent all disasters. We can prevent some disasters, but not all. But we can certainly prepare. So that's it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thanks.